Earlier this week, my husband and I attended Thanksgiving dinner at my brother's house, but things didn't go the way we expected. My brother, let's call him Brandon, is 2 years older than me. Growing up, we were inseparable, and even as adults, we've managed to maintain a close bond, at least until a few years ago when everything changed. It all started about 4 years back when I, 28F, began dating my husband, Nick, 30M. Brandon has never approved of our relationship. It's not because Nick isn't a good man. He absolutely is, and anyone who knows him would agree. We make each other incredibly happy, but Brandon refuses to see that. His disapproval boils down to one thing: Nick's background. Nick grew up with a single mom. His dad walked out on his mom when she found out she was pregnant, and her family cut ties with her for choosing to keep the baby. Despite being abandoned, Nick's mom worked tirelessly to provide for him, giving him a stable and loving home. She succeeded. Nick not only put himself through college, but also built a solid life for himself. Now, he even supports his mom, who's retired. To me, this is something to admire. My parents, both lawyers, gave Brandon and me a cushy upbringing, but what Nick and his mom achieved through sheer determination is far more inspiring. Unfortunately, Brandon doesn't see it that way. He's convinced that because Nick didn't grow up in a family like ours, he's somehow beneath us. From the moment I introduced Nick to my family, Brandon has gone out of his way to make him feel unwelcome. My parents, thankfully, never shared his attitude. But Brandon? He's made plenty of snide comments and belittling remarks over the years, and I've had countless arguments with him because of it. I've even gone weeks without talking to him after particularly bad incidents. Every time, he apologizes, promises to change, and I forgive him, only for it to happen again. Brandon wasn't thrilled when Nick and I got engaged last year, and he was even less happy when we got married 6 months ago. Still, I held out hope that he'd eventually come around. After what happened this Thanksgiving, though, I know better. This time, I don't think I can forgive him or even speak to him again. When Nick and I arrived at Brandon's house for dinner, Brandon pulled me aside and told me Nick needed to leave. He claimed Nick didn't belong with us and went so far as to call him a dirty, illiterate cleaner. Hearing those words come out of my own brother's mouth shattered me. Thanksgiving is usually hosted at my parents' house, but this year, Brandon decided to take the reins. He's a pretty talented cook, and since his wife is pregnant, he said he wanted the honor of hosting everyone at their place. He invited both Nick and me, and made a point to specifically ask for Nick to come. We thought this might finally be the olive branch Brandon had never extended before, so we accepted the invitation, hopeful that this could be a fresh start. We arrived that evening without a clue of what was about to unfold. Brandon greeted us at the door, but instead of the warm welcome we'd expected, he turned to me and said I was welcome to come in, but Nick had to go home. We were stunned. At first, we thought it might be some kind of sick joke, but Brandon quickly made it clear that he was dead serious. He explained that at the last minute, he and his wife decided to expand the guest list. Her entire extended family had been invited, not just her parents, since she wanted to see everyone while pregnant. According to Brandon, their suburban relatives rarely visited, so they were making Thanksgiving a big affair this year. The problem? Apparently, many of her relatives, aside from her parents, are snobbish and elitist, much like Brandon and his wife. I had already noticed her attitude at their wedding, where her wealthy, business-oriented family flaunted their privilege as if it were a badge of honor. Brandon outright said it would be embarrassing to introduce Nick as his brother-in-law in front of these people. He claimed it would invite questions he didn't want to answer, and to save himself the humiliation, he told Nick to turn around and leave. Hearing this, I was furious. I lost it right there on his doorstep, yelling at him without a care for who might overhear. I knew this wasn't about any last-minute invitations or social dynamics. It was just another calculated way for Brandon to humiliate Nick. If he didn't want us there, he could have told us beforehand. But no, he had us drive all the way to his house just so he could insult my husband to his face. I told him exactly what I thought of him and didn't hold back. I called him classless, knowing that would cut him deeply. Sure enough, he flared up immediately, shouting back that if I thought so little of him, I could leave too. Then, as if to twist the knife, he added that I should leave with my dirty, illiterate cleaner husband. For context, Nick worked as a janitor at a local store during college, along with a few other part-time jobs, so he could save money and pay off his student loans. It's something he's always been proud of, but to Brandon, it's just another reason to look down on him. Nick had taken out a student loan to get through college. Nothing shameful about that. And Brandon calling him dirty and illiterate was outright ridiculous. Nick is just as educated as any of us. The only difference is that he attended a good, but not elite, college because that's what he could afford. There's no shame in that either, but for some reason, Brandon loves to use it as ammunition. After Brandon's nasty comment, I completely lost it. I started hurling curses at him, and honestly, I wasn't holding back. Nick had to step in and pull me back because Brandon smirked and had the nerve to say I'd picked up Nick's language. I'm not proud to admit it, but I was so furious I was on the verge of getting physical. I wasn't embarrassed by Nick at all, far from it. What upset me was Brandon's audacity to say such vile things about my husband right in front of me, as if he thought I'd just take it. By then, things had gotten pretty loud. My parents must have overheard the shouting because they came outside to see what was happening. When they realized we were fighting, they asked Nick to take me home, promising that they'd handle everything later. I'll admit, I was disappointed they didn't immediately call Brandon out for his disgusting behavior. By that point, they had to know he'd said something awful about Nick to set me off like that. But I guess they didn't want to cause a bigger scene in front of their guests. Nick got me home, and once we were there, he helped calm me down. I ended up venting to him for a good hour before I finally started to let it go. Afterward, I blocked Brandon on everything. I was still seething, but I realized there was no point in staying angry. Brandon wasn't going to change, and I was done wasting my energy trying to fix him. I was a little let down by my parents for not addressing the situation right away, but I'm glad I didn't block them too. The next morning, they called and asked us to come to my dad's office to talk. The next morning, my parents called and asked us to come by my dad's office, saying I needed to sign some paperwork. I was curious, but also unsure what this was about. When I asked them over the phone, they didn't give me any details. Still, I figured even if it wasn't important, it would give me a chance to talk to them about what had happened with Brandon. When Nick and I arrived, my mom was there too, and both of them looked unusually serious. They didn't explain much at first, just handed me the paperwork and asked me to go through it. They told me that if I agreed with everything, they wanted me to sign it right there. I sat down and started reading through the documents, and to say I was stunned would be an understatement. The paperwork outlined the process to begin transferring ownership of my parents' law firm to me. I was floored. For as long as I could remember, it was understood that Brandon would take over the firm when my parents retired. So, just to be sure, I asked my dad if this was really what he wanted, to pass the firm on to me instead of Brandon. He didn't hesitate. He told me he was certain about his decision. After what had happened the night before, he had no intention of leaving anything to Brandon. He said this was their way of making things right with me and Nick. This was a massive deal. I did go to law school and have my degree, but I haven't practiced in 3 years. After just a year in the field, I realized it wasn't for me and left to start my own business, a bakery, which is worlds away from running a law firm. Nick works in management at his company, but isn't a lawyer either. Brandon, on the other hand, has been working under my dad for years and was clearly expecting to inherit the firm when the time came. I knew this decision was going to blindside him. I asked my parents if they were absolutely sure about this, and they assured me they were. Apparently, after all the guests had left the Thanksgiving dinner, my parents confronted Brandon and his wife about the incident with Nick and me. Instead of showing any remorse, Brandon and his wife had been completely dismissive. My parents went on to explain that Brandon and his wife didn't even try to hide their awful behavior. They openly admitted to the things they'd said about Nick, as if they genuinely believed there was nothing wrong with their actions. Naturally, my parents were furious. They had asked Brandon and his wife to call us and apologize, but they outright refused. That's when my parents decided they'd had enough. They told me they wanted nothing more to do with Brandon. This meant he wouldn't be inheriting the law firm anymore. With retirement on the horizon, they still needed someone to take over eventually, and they decided that someone should be me. Even though I wasn't a practicing lawyer, they said it was better to keep the firm in the family by passing it to me. After the incident the previous night, my parents had gone into the office early and spent 2 hours drafting the paperwork. They already had a template prepared from when they'd originally planned to transfer ownership to Brandon. Once I'd read everything over, I spoke privately with Nick about the decision. Together, we agreed to move forward and sign the paperwork, officially starting the process of transferring ownership to me. My parents wanted to celebrate, but I wasn't in the mood. I couldn't shake a feeling of unease about the whole situation. On one hand, a part of me felt vindicated. Brandon's behavior toward Nick had been disgusting, and it felt good to know my parents were taking a stand. On the other hand, I wasn't sure if taking the firm was the right thing to do. I had left practicing law after just a year because it wasn't for me. Running a law firm wasn't a dream of mine. It was Brandon's. He genuinely loved his work, and I knew he had been looking forward to leading the firm for years. Taking that opportunity from him felt wrong, almost unethical. But then I reminded myself, I wasn't stealing anything. My parents had made their choice, and they were offering this to me on their terms. Still, the uneasiness lingered. I couldn't celebrate or feel happy about it. After signing the papers, I simply thanked my parents, said goodbye, and went home. Nick and I hadn't really talked much about the situation, but the following day my parents called and said it was time for me to come into work. If I was going to take over, I'd need to start transitioning back into the firm. That day, I walked into the office and came face to face with Brandon for the first time since Thanksgiving. My parents gathered everyone and formally announced that I'd be taking over the firm in a few months when they retired. The announcement caught everyone off guard. It had always been assumed that Brandon would step into the leadership role, so the confusion in the room was palpable. Brandon didn't say a word in that moment, but I could see the tension on his face. He was far from happy. I guess he didn't want to make a scene in front of everyone, so he stayed quiet. But later that evening, after I got home, the fireworks started. Brandon called me from a burner phone and wasted no time letting me know exactly how furious he was. He accused me of orchestrating the entire thing, saying I was only doing this to spite him and that I needed to stop our parents from leaving the firm to me. The way he spoke to me, so entitled and condescending, rubbed me the wrong way immediately. I told him I wasn't going to do anything of the sort. Our parents had made their decision, and if they trusted me to take over, I didn't see why I should turn it down. I reminded him that he was the one who brought this on himself by treating me and Nick so horribly, so I didn't feel the least bit guilty about it. Then I hit him with the truth. I was going to take over the firm, and if he couldn't handle working under me, he should quit while he still had the chance. That's when Brandon lost it. He started yelling, accusing me of being unethical, and even threatened to sue me and our parents. He claimed I had no right to ruin his future just because he insulted my husband, and to make things worse, he doubled down on his cruel comments, insisting that what he'd said about Nick wasn't even untrue. Hearing that sent me over the edge. Before I knew it, I was screaming back at him, and what started as a heated argument spiraled into an all-out shouting match. We were hurling insults at each other, saying things we probably shouldn't have, but at that moment, I didn't care. The argument with Brandon ended as badly as it started. Just before he hung up, he delivered a parting shot, accusing me of being even more disgusting and pathetic than he was. He said I was selfish and unethical, and that he couldn't believe what I was doing to him. Brandon claimed he'd resign if that's what I wanted, but he also vowed to sue me and our parents for what he called unfair treatment. I don't think he has any real legal grounds for a case, but his words left me rattled. Deep down, I started questioning whether I was doing the right thing. I've talked about this with Nick countless times, and he keeps reassuring me that I've done nothing wrong. My parents have said the same. They insist that Brandon brought this on himself and that their decision to leave the firm to me is entirely fair. Even so, I can't shake the guilt. As much as Brandon's words hurt, I could tell he was genuinely devastated. I don't think that excuses how he treated Nick or me, but it still leaves me feeling conflicted. At this point, I don't know what to do or how to feel. I need some clarity because I'm completely lost. Update. The comments I've received have given me a lot to think about. First, I want to clarify something. I don't enjoy being a lawyer. I never did. I only went into law because it's what my parents wanted, and back then, I didn't have a strong passion for anything else. I always loved baking, but I never considered it a serious career option until later in life. Now, running my bakery brings me genuine joy. The thought of giving that up is what's been weighing on me the most. If I take over the law firm, I won't have the time to manage my business. It's just not possible to do both. I'll admit, my bakery isn't nearly as successful as my parents' firm, but it's something I built from the ground up. It's my passion, and it fulfills me in a way practicing law never did. The more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong to give up everything I've worked for just to get back at Brandon. It seems so petty when I step back and think about it. I opened up to Nick about how I was feeling, and he told me something that stuck. If I don't want to take over the law firm, I don't have to. I could talk to my parents, explain my feelings, and stop the process before it goes any further. But there's another side to this that I can't ignore. The idea of Brandon inheriting the firm after everything he's done makes my stomach turn. My parents have made it clear that they want the law firm to stay in the family. It's definitely nepotistic, but it's what they want, and I can't fault them for that. If I back out, the only option left is Brandon, and I'm not okay with that. At the same time, I feel like it's just as petty, if not more so, to take over the firm simply to block Brandon from getting it. I'm struggling to reconcile these feelings and figure out how to talk to my parents about all of this. Nick has been incredibly supportive through it all. He told me that feeling this way is completely normal, especially given how much Brandon and I have clashed over the years. Things between us have deteriorated to the point where reconciliation feels impossible. Maybe it could have been different if he'd ever apologized, but he hasn't, and even if he did, I doubt it would feel genuine. Right now, I'm stuck. I know I need to talk to my parents, but I don't know how to start the conversation. Update 2. I finally did it. I ripped off the Band-Aid and had the conversation I'd been dreading. It's been 8 days since Thanksgiving, and I realized I couldn't keep putting this off. Before the process moved any further, I had to tell my parents the truth. I don't want to take over the law firm. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, especially since I'd signed the paperwork just a week ago, but it had to be done. So, I invited my parents over for dinner. Last night, Nick and I sat down with my parents and told them everything. As expected, their initial reaction wasn't great. They were visibly upset and said that if I wasn't sure about taking over the firm, I shouldn't have signed the paperwork in the first place. I braced myself as they launched into a lecture about being indecisive. Honestly, I deserved it, so I didn't argue. I just listened. After they had their say, the mood shifted, and they seemed to grasp the dilemma I was facing. They suggested that if I wanted to take over the firm without being involved in the legal side of things, I could do that. But I knew that wasn't the solution for me. I didn't want to be part of the firm in any capacity because, frankly, the work itself bores me to tears. I decided to be completely honest with my parents about how I felt. While they weren't thrilled with my decision, they eventually told me it was okay. Then came the harder part, explaining why I'd agreed to take the position in the first place. I admitted that my main motivation was to prevent Brandon from inheriting the firm. This seemed to catch them off guard, as I've never been one to act out of pettiness or vindictiveness. But I couldn't sugarcoat it. I was done tolerating Brandon. His behavior had been grating on me for years, and the Thanksgiving incident was the final straw. I told my parents in no uncertain terms that I would be deeply upset if, after everything, Brandon ended up running the firm anyway. To my relief, they heard me out and said they understood where I was coming from. They agreed it would send a terrible message if they allowed Brandon to take over, especially after what had happened. Announcing my leadership in front of the entire office meant there was no turning back without damaging their credibility. Still, they were grappling with another challenge. Ensuring the firm stayed within the family. That was incredibly important to them, but with Brandon effectively out of the picture and me uninterested in the role, the solution wasn't immediately clear. Last night, Nick and I sat down with my parents and told them everything. As expected, their initial reaction wasn't great. They were visibly upset and said that if I wasn't sure about taking over the firm, I shouldn't have signed the paperwork in the first place. I braced myself as they launched into a lecture about being indecisive. Honestly, I deserved it, so I didn't argue. I just listened. After they had their say, the mood shifted, and they seemed to grasp the dilemma I was facing. They suggested that if I wanted to take over the firm without being involved in the legal side of things, I could do that. But I knew that wasn't the solution for me. I didn't want to be part of the firm in any capacity because, frankly, the work itself bores me to tears. I decided to be completely honest with my parents about how I felt. While they weren't thrilled with my decision, they eventually told me it was okay. Then came the harder part, explaining why I'd agreed to take the position in the first place. I admitted that my main motivation was to prevent Brandon from inheriting the firm. This seemed to catch them off guard, as I've never been one to act out of pettiness or vindictiveness. But I couldn't sugarcoat it. I was done tolerating Brandon. His behavior had been grating on me for years, and the Thanksgiving incident was the final straw. I told my parents in no uncertain terms that I would be deeply upset if, after everything, Brandon ended up running the firm anyway. To my relief, they heard me out and said they understood where I was coming from. They agreed it would send a terrible message if they allowed Brandon to take over, especially after what had happened. Announcing my leadership in front of the entire office meant there was no turning back without damaging their credibility. Still, they were grappling with another challenge, ensuring the firm stayed within the family. That was incredibly important to them, but with Brandon effectively out of the picture and me uninterested in the role, the solution wasn't immediately clear. My parents briefly entertained the idea of asking Brandon to take over instead of me, but that came with a whole set of complications. After the Thanksgiving incident, Brandon ignored them for nearly 3 days, which caused some significant disruptions at work. His absence stemmed from a personal argument he'd had with them the night before, and it was completely unprofessional. Then, when he finally did show up, my parents made the announcement about me taking over, and after that, he stopped coming to work entirely. He hasn't even officially resigned, leaving everything in limbo. Their relationship with Brandon is incredibly strained right now. Even if they wanted to offer him the firm again, there's no guarantee he'd accept. And on top of that, it would make them look weak and indecisive to backtrack after such a public announcement. Outside of Brandon, there's no one in the family for them to pass the firm to. I suggested they consider a few senior employees who've been dedicated and loyal to the company, people who could be just as committed as my parents have been. They tossed around a couple of names, but it was clear they weren't ready to let go of the idea of keeping the firm within the family. I knew convincing them to hand the reins to someone outside the family wouldn't happen overnight. This wasn't a decision they'd make after one conversation, so I dropped the topic for now. That said, I'm pretty sure that's where this will eventually end up. I'm not interested, and Brandon is clearly not coming back. I feel awful about putting my parents in such a difficult position. Signing the paperwork without thinking it through was a rash decision on my part, and now we're all dealing with the fallout. But despite the mess, I can't help feeling relieved that Brandon won't get away with his behavior anymore. With everything Brandon has said about Nick, not just on Thanksgiving, but over the years, I think it's about time someone holds him accountable for his behavior. I'm glad I had the chance to be that person. I know he truly loved and valued his job, but he's losing it now because of his own arrogance. Even after all this, he hasn't apologized to me or Nick. At this point, I don't even want an apology anymore. Update 3. It's been 2 weeks since my last update, and I'm happy to report that my parents have finally named a new successor for the firm. He's one of their most dedicated employees and has been with them for years. While he's not family, he's practically like family, and I think this is the best decision they could have made. Convincing my parents to pass the firm to someone outside the family wasn't easy. It took a lot of discussions and patience, but I managed to get through to them. I pointed out that there was no guarantee the firm would stay in the family forever anyway. What if their grandkids didn't want to become lawyers? The company would inevitably end up in the hands of someone outside the family, and at least this way, they had control over who that person would be. Eventually, they came around. They've already spoken to the employee, and he's thrilled about the opportunity. My parents will be starting the paperwork soon, officially scrapping the transfer to me. As for Brandon, he emailed my parents a few days ago to resign. In his message, he bragged about starting his own law firm with funding from his in-laws. He made sure to emphasize how ambitious his project was and claimed we'd all regret how we treated him. Well, shiver me timbers. I couldn't care less what he does anymore. Whatever relationship we had as siblings is over. It's been severed, and I don't think it can ever be repaired. I have no interest in repairing my relationship with Brandon. Nick and I are happy together, and my parents are content with how everything has turned out. That's all that matters to me now. Of course, there are moments when I feel a pang of sadness about what's happened. Brandon and I were so close as kids. There was a time when it felt like it was just the two of us against the world, and now we can't even stand to be in the same room. But whenever those feelings creep in, I remind myself of how he treated Nick and how much he's changed from the person I used to know. He's not the same brother who was once my best friend, and honestly, I'm not the same person either. Nick is my priority. If anyone, family included, insults or humiliates him, I have no place for them in my life. That's just the way it is. So yes, I feel bad about how things turned out, but I don't regret anything I've done. People can call me petty or vengeful if they want, but at the end of the day, I know I'm doing my best to be a good partner.